All right, Joe, we are back on the podcast, and we have taken a few weeks break now away from talking to guys about training and spiritual fitness. I know I've enjoyed a few weeks break to focus on a few other things. It looks like, Joe, you took the time and moved to Russia or something, somewhere way north. What exactly is going? Why are you wearing what you're wearing? Guys, if you can't see this, if you're not watching on YouTube, it looks like Joe maybe broke into someone's office and is like maybe was stealing something, wearing a toboggan like he's a thief, but I don't know what's going on.
Well, Evan, not everybody lives in balmy Louisiana where it's 70 degrees every day. So
It's
it's
true.
winter in Scotland. We've also had a little heating difficulty. So just dressed for warmth. That's all this is.
Heating difficulty. That's like the most polite way to say my heater broke and I'm freezing cold in Scotland right now. It's way too politely formed. But yes, I am glad that you still jumped on to the podcast, even though you're probably sitting in like 20 degrees office right now. But no, it's good to be back, and we're really kicking things back off because we just started a new 10-week New Year's challenge for guys. And guys, if you haven't yet signed up, we hope that you will go and do so. I'll leave a link in the show notes so you can get more information about that. But we're doing this, it's a challenge for guys to fight sin, really for two reasons. One, because there's something we know about guys, and that's sin, right? We know that all guys have the struggle with sin, right? The second is something we hope. We hope that guys will fight sin. We hope that they won't even just know, oh, I know I have a struggle with sin, but that they're going to begin to be equipped to go out and fight sin. And I know we've done in the past another podcast season on fighting sin, and we talked about like the 10 rules of war if you want to be a guy that begins to fight sin. But we wanted to take a little bit of a different approach with this season of the podcast to help guys as they are doing this 10-week challenge. So why don't you describe to guys why we're taking the approach we are?
Yeah, one of the rules of what we talked about was the law of replacement. The way that throughout the New Testament, you see that whenever we're told to put sin off, we're told to put something on. And so you have to actively be pursuing virtue if you want to see the sort of deadly passions begin to wither. Now that immediately raises an issue, and that's that most of us men, we don't really have a clear picture of godliness. So when we're told, for example, to put off lust or anger or pride, we're not exactly sure what the opposing thing is that we're meant to be putting on. And so I think what we want to do is try to really give guys a compelling picture of godliness, something that you'll wake up and think, oh, that's the guy I want to be. And even though it's a long path to get there, that you begin to pray for this stuff, you begin to do small disciplines that help you grow in these areas, but you're not just, again, trying to resist, but put on what you're meant to be.
That's good. So we are going to help guys. I think guys have all probably heard of like the 7 deadly sins, right? So our aim is to kind of take the opposing view there and to say, what would 7 godly characteristics be? What are 7 ways that guys can grow, the 7 virtues of godly characteristics? So we're going to kind of take those one by one over the season. Our hope is that this will be good in combination with what guys are doing in that 10-week challenge for this time of New Year's, when guys are looking for a reset, looking for a way to grow, hopefully looking for a way to begin to fight sin. Not only will you fight what you know you're struggling with, but have something to put on, pursue something. So I want to kick us off this week with talking about humility, and as that being a virtue that guys need to put on, something they need to push forward. I guess all cards on the table here, a little behind the scenes here. I did not have humility as our first episode in this podcast season, but you changed it. You said let's do humility first. So I want to just start by saying why was humility so important to you to start with?
Yeah, one thing that people have said for a long time is that humility, it's not the highest virtue, but it's the first one. And what they mean by that is that this is in a sense, the entry point of God's grace. If you ask the question, where is God? In Isaiah 57, it talks about he's in the high and holy place, but it also says he's with the humble and the contrite spirit. And so there's this sense that like the beginning of any growth, it doesn't, the beginning, it's not love and it's not patience, it's humility, is this recognition of weakness before God. And so if they're going to be serious about this path of spiritual growth, they need to know about this posture, that it's got to characterize their heart from the very outset if they're going to be in that place where God's grace is going to begin to gather and really produce transformation.
All right, so I want to give guys a working definition of humility so that we can begin to, push them that way, that they will want to grow in this virtue. But before we get to a good definition of humility, I think it's important for us to see what humility is not, because I read in business books or listen to podcasts. I think humility is thrown out there a lot. But some of it, I think there's just some common misconceptions when we hear about humility. So let's start by talking about what humility is not.
Yeah, well, I mean, one thing it's not is pretending not to be proud. Evan, you're from, I think you're from Texas. I was born in Texas. We both live in Louisiana. Where we come from, we all know how to act like we're humble. People mistake humility because you just know that you don't show off or kind of agree with someone if they compliment you. And often, it's just that sort of pretense, or it's that kind of superficial thing that's what we think humility is. And the first thing we've got to recognize is humility is not just kind of a social mask. It's an attitude of the heart. So if it's not in your heart, it's not humility. It's actually just pride kind of subversively pretending and counterfeiting to be humility. And that's just, all pride's equally dangerous. So it's not a surface thing.
Yeah, I'm definitely very familiar with the whole pretending not to be proud bit as humility. I'd say personally, when I do that, it's exhausting. Like, it's not, I can tell it's not truly humility because it's super exhausting to try to pretend to just not be proud and think that that's humility. But also relationally, it gets old. Like when somebody else is doing that and they think they're being humble, but they're really just pretending not to be proud. I don't know. You can see through it. Relationally, you can see through it with other people, and it gets old after a while. So I definitely can say that's a misconception I've seen before, and that I also fall into occasionally. But it can't be humility. Humility can't be just pretending not to be proud. What's another misconception of humility?
Yeah, I think another one is that humility is having a low view of yourself. So it's kind of not acknowledging gifting or ability to contribute, these kinds of things. And Spurgeon actually has got a really interesting quote about what humility is not. And I'm just going to read this because I think it's helpful for guys. But he says, it is not humility to underrate yourself. Humility is to think of yourself, if you can, as God thinks of you. It's to feel that if we have talents, God has given them to us, and let it be seen that, like freight in a vessel, they tend to sink us low. Humility is not to say, I have not this gift, but I have the gift and I must use it for my master's glory. I think it's really important because we often, think that we have to live in denial, because we feel like we do have gifting, but even acknowledge that somehow that's pride. And that's not pride, that's responsibility. That's stewardship. Right. So we don't want to think less of ourselves. With humility, we're wanting an accurate view of who we are, but also that recognition that if there's a gift, it's a gift. God gave it to us, which is why we're responsible to use it for him.
That's personally convicting because I find myself often walking into a room and believing that I am the stupidest person in the room. Like, I look around and I'm like, you know what, of all the people here, I'm definitely not the smartest guy here. And I believe that. And I then start to think, well, that just makes me humble, right? That just means that I have an accurate view of myself and I'm just not that. But I think you're saying, well, wait a second, don't deny what you have as a gift, not to be overlooked, right? That you shouldn't walk in and say, oh, well, I'm the biggest idiot here. That's not humility.
Yeah. No, it's a true and accurate view. It's not one that lives in denial.
Okay, that's good. All right, what other misconception have you seen out there of humility?
I think just generally, we think of humility as a kind of weakness. I mean, if you were to think of manliness, just whatever comes to your mind, again, humility is not typically one of those traits that we think, oh, that's manly, that's strength, that's masculine, or these type things. And the thing about humility is, if you actually ask the question, what are the biggest opponents we face spiritually? The really gnarly sinful passions that they pin us in just seconds. And for me, it's pride, and it's hypocrisy, and it's envy, and it's vanity. These are giants. And if I try to, wrestle these things, I immediately just am yelling uncle. But the thing is, humility, if humility takes root in your heart, it actually can defeat these things. It is the strength that overcomes the biggest of opponents in these, in the spiritual stage of battle. And so when we think about humility, it's meek, it's self-effacing, it doesn't draw attention to itself, but it's not weakness. This is a strength to overcome the biggest spiritual obstacles in our life. And so we've got to view it as strength, not as weakness.
Yeah, I've often, we talk about humility sometimes as like, okay, this is Christ, right? Christ was ultimately the great example of humility. And so then we would say, well, then it is strength. It must be strength, that this is what, Christ was portraying to us, and this is who Christ is. And we need to pursue that kind of strength. I get all that. I guess what I'm trying to say is, logically, I understand what you're saying, that humility is strength. But honestly, I get wrapped up in my feelings a lot. And so while I know that humility is strength, honestly, Joe, it doesn't feel strength. It feels weak. It feels weak.
Right. And this is the secret to so much of our spiritual lives. What Paul says, when I am weak, then I am strong. This idea that there's a strength that's not rooted in self, but when we are emptied of self, it breaks forth, and it's the power of God in us. But that's what humility unleashes, in a sense. And so that's where it's not a posture of weakness. It looks weak in the eyes of the world. What we know from every story throughout the Old Testament and in the New Testament, but all of these kind of Old Testament stories with Gideon, the Red Sea, David and Goliath, it's from that position of meekness and humility that God accomplishes great victories for his people.
That's good. That's helpful. Before we jump into like an actual definition of humility, anything else, any other misconceptions that you know of out there that you've seen of humility?
Yeah, I think just it's not a feeling. I think guys just tend to think, do I feel humble? And if you're talking about what real humility is, I like to think of it as the child of your will and your mind. So first, think about your mind. We've already said this, but to reiterate the point, it's a true conception. It's actually knowing the truth about yourself. So there's that aspect, but then there's also the will, where you, like Jesus, say, not my will, but yours be done. And that's a choice. And what's important about that is we don't have a lot of control with our feelings. We can direct our mind. We can make choices. And so this is what opens up the possibility for Christian men to begin to practice humility and not just kind of wait for it to just rise up spontaneously as some kind of affection of the heart.
That's good. That's good. All right. So we know humility is not pretending to be proud. Pretending not to be proud. Humility is not, having a low view of yourself. It's not weakness. It's not some feeling that you have. All right. So what is humility then, Joe? We know what it's not. What is it? Give me a definition.
Well, here's my definition, which might be worth about a half a penny, but but it's accepting the truth that before God, I am nothing, I have nothing, and I can do nothing. Therefore, I'm totally dependent upon God and totally available to God. And I realize there's a lot, it's a mouthful. And so I want to break it down so guys can kind of see piece by piece what I'm talking about. And, the first thing is just that recognition that before God, I'm nothing. And, what we see, just think in the Bible, you think of Moses at the Red Sea, or again, you think of Gideon with his 300 next to the Midianites. They're nothing. They are not a Marvel hero that can bring about some kind of victory or do some sort of miracle. They've got nothing. And it's that recognition that before God, I don't have really anything of myself to contribute. So I am nothing, I have nothing, and that I can do nothing. And when you begin to recognize this, that, okay, that this is where dependency comes from, that because this is the facts, I'm not exaggerating, I'm not making anything up with here, that what all of a sudden happens is I realize that I'm totally dependent upon God. And this is where, again, we've already talked about weakness being strength, but that's what we see in the scriptures, that as soon as we begin to rely upon God, he has this willingness to then step in and do things in our life that wouldn't get done otherwise. And so, when you realize that position that you're in, it results in a dependency. But then what it also should result in, and this is really important for guys to think about, it should also result in an availability. That, okay, I'm not just dependent, but I realize you're God and I'm not. And so I'm making myself available. And there's this phrase that you'll hear in the Old Testament where people like Abraham or Mary in the New Testament, they say, "Here I am." And that's a great statement of what humility is. It's waking up and realizing, okay, Lord, you've got the wisdom, you've got the power. I don't. Here I am. I'm dependent upon you. This is going to be my posture for today. And I think, when you put those ingredients together, you begin to really see what the essence of humility is.
That's good. So in your definition, I'm going to repeat it here, and I'll list it in the show notes because it's really good. Before God, I am nothing. Before God, I have nothing. Before God, I can do nothing. Therefore, I'm totally dependent on God, and I'm totally available to God. Right? That's the working definition. So here's something I'm seeing in that is you keep saying before God. Before God, I am this. Before God, I had. Here's what I often hear in definitions of humility. It's a relational thing. So I guess I'm seeing a difference in how you're saying this is oftentimes I think of humility as what it does to my relationships with others. But you're defining humility as something that happens with my relationship before God, who I am before God, not who I am before men. Am I seeing that correctly?
Yeah. I think if you begin with other people, you have a different effect when you have a comparison, because, for example, if I'm with somebody else, I might legitimately be smarter, or they might be legitimately smarter. It easily becomes this thing where, well, I can take pride because of how I'm better, or I can feel shame because I'm worse. And there's this kind of a false comparison, what Proverbs would call unequal scales. When you start with God, it's a totally different thing. Before him, you have this place where it doesn't really matter because, who I am next to this other person, because they're not the standard. If I'm morally upright compared to my neighbor, well, my neighbor, is a sinner just like I'm a sinner. I'm not righteous because I'm better than him. Before God, I'm unrighteous. I'm a sinner. And it's that true understanding of what defines me as my relationship fundamentally with God. And if I get that right, what happens is there begins to be a freedom from comparison with my neighbor. And I think that's a really important thing because, for example, this is why humble men often have great courage before other people. Because, Paul, he has a statement in Galatians where he basically says, he was unimpressed with the other apostles. He like how people, their worldly importance in his eyes, it doesn't matter to him. And the reason was he was so caught up with who Jesus was, he could stand before Caesar or he could stand before Peter and he could just say whatever needed to be said because he didn't really define himself in relation to those kinds of power structures or sort of social statuses of people. And so if they'll begin with God, it'll mean that, first of all, they don't get puffed up about the wrong stuff, but equally that they're not overly impressed with people such that they begin to be, for example, cowardly when they need to be courageous in confronting people.
Yeah, when I see humility defined, like especially if you read books, business books in particular, I'll say, who have caught on to the idea that humility is important. Yeah. It's important. But often what I'm seeing is that humility is ultimately a tool for advancement. So define humility however you want to, and you can pick, tell people how to do it. But ultimately what we're saying, or what they're saying in the books, is you need humility if you want to advance, if you want to, if you want to be better in business, if you want, and it ultimately becomes a relational thing, or it becomes one of the tools in your tool belt on your way to a better career. But I think what you're trying to do in this definition, what I hear at least, is just trying to answer that question. Not who am I before other people, who am I in my career? Is humility a tool in my tool belt? We need guys, if they want to grow in character, to answer the question, who am I before God? That's the more important question, is who am I before God? Not what tool can I pull out today? Because then humility does become something that you just pick up and take to work with you at some point. It's like, okay, well, I know I'm going to need humility in this conversation. Let me bring it with me now. But it's also something you can put down in that, if that's true. Whereas you're saying humility is a way you identify yourself before God. So that's super helpful.
I think it's really important. I think like a sort of Jim Collins level 5 leader, the kind of person who's known for their humility. But the whole context is, how can I, like you said, use people to move along what I view as the purpose of my life, what my kind of plan for myself is, which that still is rooted in a me-centered universe. What humility does is it displaces the self. It's a God-centered universe. And so it doesn't really matter, what my plan for myself is. Again, I'm waking up saying, here I am, God, what's your plan for my life? And only if I start there God is the center of everything, can I really say that my heart is humble and in this right spot?
That's really good. All right, so I want you to just scare me to death here for a second, Joe, because I like your definition of humility, and I like how we've kind of gone back and forth with some of those misconceptions. But I want to pitch something to you. Say I spend the next 10 years of my life not pursuing humility, not trying to grow in humility, not caring about growing in humility at all. What can I expect? All right. So I'm a guy who maybe I know what humility is, but I'm going to not spend 10 years trying to grow in humility. What can I expect?
Yeah, you're gonna have a bad marriage. You're gonna have kids that don't like you. You're not gonna have many friends. I mean, the fact is that what grows in place of humility is pride,
Yeah.
and that me-centered mentality produces all kinds of ugly things that make us miserable. So things like just that envy, where I'm constantly comparing myself and sad about good things happening to others, or it makes me a narcissist. I can't listen, which means I can't relate, and so that's gonna, affect my marriage. In the workplace, it's going to be all about you, which your colleagues, they're going to realize what it's like to work with somebody like that. So, I mean, it's not just about, the practical benefits, but if you take humility out, the result is not something that leads to happiness and success and flourishing. It's something that leads to Ebenezer Scrooge, where you're cold and you're lonely and you're all by yourself and, are miserable.
Yeah, and I think you highlighted something there that I think is important because one of the things I hear guys often say, especially guys that begin to get into their 30s and even into their 40s, is one of the things they notice they're missing is relationships. So they'll often say, I'm lonely, like I am. I'm lonely or I'm alone in my life. Does humility have anything to do with that, perhaps? What is there any relationship between humility and the fact that guys are just lonely?
Yeah. Without humility, we're going to hide. And one of the reasons we're going to hide is often we're protecting ourselves. We have egos that bruise really easily. We're trying to put on a face before people and be something that we're not, and we're unwilling to confront and acknowledge the truth about ourselves. I mean, the wonder of humility is if humility begins to take root, is that you can actually begin to hear the truth about yourself without being crushed. And for a lot of us, that's an incredible thought. There's this amazing story of Hudson Taylor, the famous missionary, and he was traveling through Canada, and he's reading the newspaper, and there's like this review of his talk that he gave like a day or two before, and it's just super critical. And it's about how he's not that impressive as a speaker, and how there's all these preachers in Canada who can speak better than he can, and he's short and he just seems like a nice Englishman. And he just laughed. And, he made a comment to the person next to him that he often felt like God had made him small so he could show how great God was. It's like, how amazing. I would just be, in the dustbin if I was reading something like that about me in the newspaper. It just was water off his back because he didn't view himself as being special. He thought God was amazing and God did amazing things through him, but it was God, not him. So an unbruised ego, how amazing would that be?
Yeah, yeah. The ability to hear the truth about myself without being crushed. That sounds fantastic. I'd say there's another end to that too. What about the truth? The ability to hear the truth about yourself without getting angry, without being angered into like, wait a second, hold on. Don't say those things about, right? That's one of the benefits of humility as well.
Yeah, because that's what pride does. I mean, you sort of flare up and begin to live in this denial and protect yourself and lash out because somebody just acknowledged something that's legitimate. I think again a different story. Francis of Assisi, famous medieval saint. I mean, he used to, whenever somebody would say something good about him, he'd turn around to one of the brothers that one of his friends, spiritual friends, and be like, "Okay, now be honest. Tell me something true about me." And there's this ability to again receive criticism, and it didn't irritate and it didn't inflame any kind of ire. And it was again just because he just had a low, not an untrue, but he realized he was imperfect. I mean, yeah. Like, there's no surprise there. We're sinners. We're a lot worse than anybody realizes that we are. So we should stop pretending to be something we're not.
Yeah. So give me some positive things for guys to see as they catch this vision of pursuing this characteristic of humility, what are some of the benefits that they're going to, I mean, we've already kind of named a few just in conversation, but what else would you identify as something for guys to look forward to, a benefit of, hey, if you do spend the next 10 years pursuing growing in humility, what can we expect?
Yeah. I think one of them, and this is often a definition you'll hear people talk about, that humility is not thinking less of yourself, but thinking of yourself less often, that self-forgetfulness that people describe. I mean, if we were honest, wouldn't it be wonderful for that charm, that spell that we're under, where we have to constantly think about ourselves and constantly fixate on how other people view us? Wouldn't it be amazing for that spell to be broken, to actually be freed up to live before other people? I think of like just so many of the things that really make me miserable are caused from this. It's like my eyes are just curved inward and I'm just, staring at myself all the time. And I'd love to stop staring at the mirror so much. And so if guys, with this humility, what'll happen is you'll realize there's a lot more interesting things in the universe than just your own ego. Starting with God, but moving beyond there. And so you'll be freed up to think about other people and have all the joy that comes from having, genuine relationships of love with God and with people.
That's good. Yeah, I think about just the advantage that having humility can do when you're in times of suffering, of difficulty.
Yeah.
Right. Just the knowing the truth about yourself and who you are before God during time. Because look, life is not always going to be peachy, right? There's going to be times when there is suffering and humility, or suffering and difficulty in our lives. So if you choose not to grow in humility and you do then face those times of suffering, I think you're missing something, right? It's going to be a different time, much more of a struggle.
Well, and I think so often we're resisting what God's doing. I mean, if you start from this premise that God wants us humble, well, what's the way that you're typically humble? It comes through being often humiliated. It's a painful process. But if I think of those moments where I've had these jarring, times of shame, where I've had this ideal of myself, and before somebody I've fallen short, and just the pain of not being that false self that I thought I was or should be, rather than realizing God's showing me something, he's stripping me of that idol. That's not who I am. For him to expose that and take that away, that's not cruelty, that's love. That doesn't mean I don't have worth, but he's not going to let me have false worth. And there's this way that so often we're like pushing against the current. Like, we don't want to be humbled. We're not going to accept the Lord taking away the pretentious existence that we are pretending to have. But if we can embrace the process and say, hey, look, God wants me humble. If I'm humble, then his grace is going to flood in, just like water gathers in the lowest place, is going to come into my heart. And if we start there, then all of a sudden we're going to be a little bit more okay when life doesn't go our way, and a little bit more resilient, because we'll know that it's going to be through these trials that God's going to produce something beautiful in our life, and beautiful that's going to affect other people.
That's great. All right, so I want to begin to close this conversation out, but I don't want to end it by this is a pet peeve of mine. I don't want to end it by saying be humble and just leave guys there, right? like guys know they need to be humble. So let's point guys towards deliberate practice. I'm all about how can we begin to practice this today? So can you give guys a small tweak they can begin to make today in their behaviors that will help them to pursue how to be humble?
Yeah. I mean, 3 things. We'll talk mind, will, and body. First, mind. There's this element of actually seeing yourself rightly. And in order to begin to be more humble, we need to think and meditate on the cross. The cross humbles the pretentiousness of the human heart. It reveals we have no righteousness in and of ourselves, and just takes all the all the legalism and all the performancism kind of away from us. And so in order to really think rightly, meditate on the cross and what it is saying about you and your need for the grace of God. So that's the mind. In terms of the will, pray. No matter what you pray, the mere act of prayer is saying, I can't do this myself. That's why you pray. If you can do it yourself, you don't pray. You pray because you need God to get involved. So every time you pray, it's an act of humility, acknowledging you need God and you need his grace. So pray. And the third thing, your body. I would encourage guys to consider fasting, because fasting is, in a sense, a public display before God of humility. It's saying, look, what I really, really, really need is not this next meal. I need spiritual food. I need you. And so it's this small act of self-denial, not for the sake of righteousness. It's just another mode of prayer, just saying, Lord, I need your strength, which comes through my acknowledgement of my weakness. And so I think if guys will meditate, if they'll pray, if they'll fast, these are three things that can help us grow in humility.
Great. That's actually helpful and something we can send guys to do today, this week. And guys, if you're looking for maybe a guide for how to begin to meditate in the way that Joe's talking about, a guide to launch into that prayer life where you are humble before God, I'd point out one of the resources we have, hymn workouts. This is 100 different exercises that will get you in a posture of meditating. This is basically taking the words of an old hymn and teaching you how to meditate on them, putting you in a position where you're starting to see, man, look, we've got hymns in there that are talking about the cross, like Joe mentioned. Maybe what I'll do is I'll include in the show notes, maybe 2 hymns that, Joe, you would think, okay, these are ones that will help guys if they want to start to practice humility. Meditate on these hymns. It will drive you towards prayer, and it will drive you towards this long growth, this long path of growing in humility. So guys, that's a step you can take today. You can begin to do today. And I'd say, look, going forward, we are in the middle of a 10-week challenge for guys who want to fight sin. We want you to be fit for this fight against sin. If you are not fit for that fight, it's not too late to join that challenge. It's not too late to jump in with us. If you maybe are in a position where you're like, I don't know if I'm quite sure if I want to join a challenge yet, but I'm interested in what y'all are talking about, look, join our mailing list, our email mailing list, because what you're going to do is every week you're going to receive part of what the challenges that we're sending out to guys. So you can kind of peek in if you're hesitant at this point. You can peek in and see what it is that we're talking about, what it is that we're doing. So I'll leave a link where you can join our mailing list, begin to see what it would look like for you to be fit for that fight against sin. And then join us next week. We're going to continue talking about another virtue that you need to be pursuing.